researcher Bryce Johnson has received a strange photograph of a human-like hand with claws.
He goes on to say, I threw it back into the woods, but it wasn't until then that I realized what I may have had in my possession.
Before Bryce Johnson broke his silence, no one knew the truth about what the Expedition Bigfoot team uncovered beneath that hidden ridge, an underground chamber filled with giant bones, disturbing signs of habitation, and evidence that something enormous still lives below. A long-kept secret. For years, Bryce Johnson kept one secret buried beneath layers of contracts, confidentiality agreements, and quiet warnings from people he still refuses to name. Viewers of Expedition Bigfoot thought they had seen the team's most intense moments, the thermal hits, the vocalizations captured on audio equipment, the moments of tension when something unseen moved through the darkness just beyond their cameras. But Bryce insists the show never aired the most important discovery of all, the one that happened the night the crew followed a strange resonance deep into an unmarked ridge somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. The exact coordinates remain classified, locked away in files that Bryce claims extend beyond the production company, reaching into agencies that don't typically concern themselves with reality television. And alongside this dwelling, they discovered what Bryce can only describe as a graveyard. Not the scattered remains of prey animals, not the random detritus of a predator's feeding ground, but an organized collection of massive skeletal remains that suggested ritual, intelligence, and a social structure far more complex than mainstream science has ever attributed to any undiscovered North American primate. The implications of that discovery, Bryce says, changed everything he thought he knew about the subject. It transformed Bigfoot from a cryptid into something that demanded to be taken seriously, something that built, that mourned, that created spaces for the living and the dead. The network never aired this footage. The episode was supposedly cut due to technical difficulties and contractual complications with land management agencies. Now, years after signing documents that should have kept him silent forever, Bryce has decided the truth matters more than legal consequences. He's speaking out because he believes the public deserves to know what exists in the remote wilderness areas of North America. He believes the cave represents proof that Bigfoot isn't just a wandering creature occasionally glimpsed by startled hikers. It's an intelligent species with culture, with territory, with a history that extends back further than anyone imagined. But before Bryce could reveal what lay inside that cavern, he first had to find it. And the journey into that ridge began with a sound that shouldn't have existed, the descent into the ridge. The discovery began with a low-frequency hum, rustle a chord detected near a jagged rock formation jutting from a steep hillside covered in old-growth forest. The location wasn't particularly remarkable. Countless similar formations dotted the region, remnants of ancient geological upheaval. But this ridge had been flagged by locals as an area of unusual activity. Hikers reported feeling watched. Hunters described finding game trails that ended abruptly. One forestry worker claimed he'd heard sounds coming from the rocks themselves, deep reverberations that made his chest vibrate. The team searched for an entrance for over an hour. They found it almost by accident, a fissure running along the side of the ridge, partially obscured by deadfall and decades of accumulated forest debris. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through sideways. Bryce went first, turning his shoulders at an angle, feeling cold stone scraping against his chest and back. His headlamp caught something immediately, grooves along the interior walls, not random scratches from erosion. These were parallel marks, evenly spaced, running horizontally for several feet. They were claw marks. The grooves were too wide for any known animal in the region, too wide for bear claws, too uniform for random gouging. Russell believed they were territorial markers. Bryce wasn't so sure. The marks looked functional, like they'd been made while something was pushing itself through the passage. 20 feet into the mountain, the passage widened into a natural tunnel tall enough to stand in. Air moved through it, not stagnant atmosphere, but genuine circulation. The air was warm compared to the freezing night outside, carrying the faint smell of whetstone and mineral deposits. But underneath lay something else, something organic. A musky animal smell that reminded Bryce of visiting a zoo as a child. It wasn't decomposition, it was the smell of something alive, something that had been there recently. As they pushed deeper, the walls opened into a cavern so large their headlamps couldn't touch the ceiling. The beams vanished into darkness above. The floor was relatively flat, covered in fine sediment that crunched under their boots. And that was when Bryce saw the first bone. Massive, curved, protruding from the dirt like some prehistoric artifact. But this bone wasn't ancient history, and what surrounded it would prove they'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple animal den. The giant bones and evidence of presence. The first bone lay half buried near the center of the cavern floor, its curve catching Bryce's headlamp. At first glance, it resembled a rib, but the scale was immediately wrong. This was far larger than any deer or elk. The bone was nearly 4 feet long, with a circumference suggesting it came from a creature with a massive chest cavity. Mireya's first instinct was to classify it as megafauna, perhaps a fossilized remain from the Pleistocene epoch when giant mammals roamed North America. But as Bryce began brushing away dirt, that theory collapsed. The bone wasn't fossilized. It was relatively fresh, weathered, but not mineralized. The surface still had the texture of bone rather than rock. Then they found the femur. It lay 3 feet away, partially concealed beneath debris. The thigh bone was nearly 3 feet long and required both hands to hold. More significantly, its structure was wrong for any quadruped. The joint attachments, the angle of articulation, the curvature, everything suggested it came from a creature that walked upright. This bone was built for bipedal locomotion, for supporting massive weight on 2 legs rather than 4. The team spread out across the cavern floor, revealing more bones with each sweep of their lights. Vertebrae the size of dinner plates, finger bones longer than bratwurst, a shoulder blade shaped like a shovel and twice as thick as any human equivalent. Each discovery reinforced the same impossible conclusion. These remains came from something enormous that walked upright, something with a skeletal structure between human and something else entirely. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the size. It was their arrangement. They weren't scattered randomly. These bones had been placed deliberately. Certain elements were clustered together, ribs with ribs, long bones parallel to each other. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it demonstrated clear intentionality. This wasn't a kill site. This was a burial. Something had arranged these remains with purpose, with what could only be described as reverence. Burial of the dead is considered a hallmark of intelligence, of social complexity. And apparently, Bigfoot buried its dead. As the team moved deeper, they found more signs of habitation. A flat stone slab positioned against the far wall, roughly 8 feet long, bore a deep indentation worn smooth in the center. Bryce recognized it as a crude sleeping area. Adjacent to this stone bed lay piles of stripped branches woven together into thick mats. The plant material was dried, but not completely decomposed. The weaving showed deliberate pattern, creating cushioning that would provide insulation from cold stone. Higher up the walls, well above head height, scratch marks scarred the stone in clusters. The gouges were deep, requiring significant force. Bryce stood on his toes with his arm fully extended and couldn't come close to touching the lowest marks. Whatever made these scratches stood at least 8 or 9 feet tall. Near the stone sleeping platform arranged on a natural shelf, the team discovered a half-crushed deer skull placed neatly beside several large rocks. The skull wasn't gnawed or torn apart. It was intact except for crushed damage to the cranium, and it had been positioned deliberately. Around the skull, smaller bones formed a rough circle. Ribs, leg bones, vertebrae from multiple animals arranged in decorative or symbolic fashion. Perhaps the strangest discovery was twisted branches arranged into patterns along the walls. These weren't random deadfall. Each formation consisted of multiple branches deliberately bent and interwoven, then wedged into cracks or propped against stone surfaces. Some formed X-shaped crosses. Others created angular spirals. The team had encountered similar structures in forests during previous investigations, often dismissed as natural weather damage. But finding them inside a cave, arranged with clear purpose, demolished those explanations. Then Bryce found something that made everything else seem mundane. Near the tunnel leading deeper into the mountain, he noticed an unusual depression in the dirt. He knelt, brushing away sediment, revealing what lay beneath. A footprint. Massive, clear, unmistakable. The print was 17 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions pressed deep into hardened mud. Dirt was still packed into the crevices, the edges retained moisture, the clay still slightly pliable. This print wasn't old. Something had made this track recently, possibly within days, maybe hours. And if something had been here recently, where had it gone? The moment that changed everything. The crew reached the far end of the main cavern where the space narrowed into another tunnel. The walls showed signs of modification, intentional widening in spots, cleared of debris. A pathway maintained over time, leading somewhere deeper. Bryce approached the opening carefully, his headlamp probing into darkness. He leaned in and froze. The mud on the tunnel floor was disturbed. Fresh, obvious disruption. Tracks pressed into soft earth with clarity. Deep impressions, heavy, the kind of weight distribution from something massive moving deliberately. The tracks led away from the chamber, deeper into the mountain. But a second set of tracks told a more unsettling story. These prints led toward the main chamber, approaching from the deeper tunnels. And these prints were even larger, wider, longer, pressed deeper into the mud. Something enormous had walked up from the depths, entered the living chamber, and then retreated back into darkness. Before Russell could investigate further, everyone froze. A sound echoed from somewhere down the tunnel. Not water dripping, not wind, not stone settling. This was something else. A deep rumble, resonant and powerful, seeming to emanate from the stone itself. Low frequency, felt as much as heard, vibrating through the cavern floor and up through their boots, into their legs and chest. Bryce said later that it sounded like a vocalization, not mechanical, not geological, but organic. The kind of sound produced by a living throat, vocal cords vibrating, air pushed through a large chest cavity. This was communication, a warning, a territorial declaration, an announcement that the space was occupied and the occupant had noticed intruders. The rumble lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then faded into oppressive silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then the ground vibrated under their boots. Not dramatically, but subtle, as if something extremely heavy had just taken a step somewhere in the tunnel system. The vibration repeated. Then again, something was moving down there, something massive. Enough that its footfalls transmitted through solid rock. The sound was down there, not approaching, but not retreating either. What became absolutely clear was that something living inhabited these tunnels. This was its territory, its home, and the team had just walked uninvited into a space where they were very much not the dominant presence. Bryce's instinct screamed at him to leave, not to run, but to retreat methodically, immediately, while retreat remained possible. Whatever vocalized down in that darkness had made its position clear. This space belonged to something else, and that something had just announced its presence in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Whatever vocalized down in that darkness had made its position clear, and the team's escape would reveal just how closely they were being watched. The exit. And the cover-up. The team backed out in silence, each step carefully placed. Nobody speaking, everyone intensely aware that they were withdrawing from territory that didn't belong to them. The casual confidence that typically characterized their field investigations had vanished entirely. Their lights swept across the walls as they retraced their path through the narrow tunnel toward the entrance fissure. The scratch marks they'd noticed on the way in seemed more ominous now, less like ancient territorial marking and more like recent maintenance on frequently traveled routes. Shadows moved at the edges of their headlamp beams, tricks of light and exhausted nerves creating phantom movement where none existed. At least, that's what Bryce told himself as they squeezed back through the tight opening into the cold mountain night. As the last team member emerged onto the hillside, gulping fresh air and feeling the psychological relief of open sky overhead, a second vocalization erupted from inside the ridge. This wasn't the low rumble they'd heard in the depths. This was sharper, louder, resonating from somewhere much closer to the entrance they'd just exited. Almost a roar, but not quite. The sound had structure, modulation, the quality of language rather than simple animal aggression. It felt intelligent. It felt like a response, like something reacting with purpose to their presence and their departure. The vocalization lasted several seconds, echoing across the dark forest, causing birds to erupt from nearby trees despite the late hour. The sound was powerful enough to carry for what must have been miles, announcing to anything within hearing range that territory had been violated and defended. Then silence returned, broken only by the team's labored breathing and the whisper of wind through pine branches. They hiked back to their base camp without discussion, packed equipment with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than cold, and drove down the mountain as dawn began coloring the eastern sky. Within hours of their return to civilization, park officials arrived at their lodging. Not forest rangers, making routine visits. These were higher-level personnel, accompanied by individuals whose affiliations remained deliberately vague. They carried documentation declaring the cavern part of a dangerous, unstable geological zone, subject to immediate closure and investigation by structural safety teams. The language was bureaucratic, official, but the subtext was clear. The site was off-limits permanently, without appeal or discussion. They confiscated equipment, laptops, external hard drives, memory cards, footage from cameras that had documented the entire descent and discovery. They cited regulations, permits, land management policies. Everything was processed with official paperwork, stamped forms, receipt documentation. All perfectly legal, all completely effective at removing every piece of digital evidence the team had collected. Except they didn't get everything. Bryce had learned caution during previous investigations, particularly after incidents where promising evidence had mysteriously vanished or been dismissed by authorities without serious examination. Bryce had developed the habit of transferring critical files to a hidden flashcard that never left his person, a backup that existed outside official channels. When the officials collected the team's electronics, Bryce's pocket held images of the bones, detailed photographs of the footprint, wide-angle shots documenting the burial arrangement and the living space modifications. Not comprehensive documentation, but enough to prove they'd found something significant. Enough that no amount of official denial could erase what they'd discovered. Within a week, non-disclosure agreements appeared, legal documents drafted by attorneys representing entities whose names were redacted from the paperwork. The message was clear: discuss the cave and face legal consequences. The agreements cited safety concerns, protected lands, cultural heritage preservation, language that sounded reasonable in courtroom contexts, but functioned primarily to ensure silence. The team signed. They had careers to protect, families to support, futures that couldn't afford the kind of legal entanglement that fighting these documents would entail. But signing an agreement doesn't erase memory. It doesn't delete knowledge. And for Bryce, the weight of what he'd seen in that cave grew heavier with each passing year. The undeniable evidence that something intelligent inhabited those mountains, something that deserved recognition beyond cryptozoology forums and late-night television programs, which is why, after years of silence enforced by legal threats and professional pressure, Bryce decided the truth mattered more than consequences, and the cave represented proof that would change everything we thought we knew about what shares North America with us. Why he's speaking out. According to Bryce, the cave wasn't just a shelter, the kind of natural refuge that any large mammal might utilize during harsh weather or seasonal migrations. This was fundamentally different from the temporary dens bears excavate for winter hibernation or the rock overhangs where mountain lions rest between hunts. Everything they documented suggested permanent or semi-permanent habitation. The stone sleeping platform showed wear patterns consistent with repeated use over extended periods. The bedding materials, while not fresh, hadn't decomposed to the degree that would indicate abandonment years earlier. The food remains, particularly the arranged skull and bone decorations, demonstrated ongoing activity, hunting, consumption, and the disposal or display of remnants in ways that suggested ritual or symbolic meaning rather than mere pragmatism. Bryce believes they stumbled into a location Bigfoot once called home, possibly still does, depending on interpretation of the fresh tracks and the timing of the vocalization. The evidence suggests cyclical use at minimum, territory that the creatures return to seasonally or periodically, maintaining the space even during periods of absence. But the possibility that something remained in the deeper tunnels during the team's visit. that the vocalization represented a current occupant warning away intruders rather than a returning resident discovering trespassers changes the calculus entirely. The implications extend beyond a single cave in a single mountain range. If this site exists, maintained, and occupied, then the question becomes, how many others exist? The Pacific Northwest contains thousands of miles of unmapped wilderness, countless cave systems and geological formations that have never been thoroughly explored. If Bigfoot populations utilize subterranean networks as primary residences rather than surface shelters, that would explain decades of failed attempts to locate definitive evidence. Investigators have been searching in the wrong places, looking for surface signs of creatures that might spend most of their time underground. The hum rustle detected, the low-frequency vibrations that led them to the cave in the first place, might represent something even more extraordinary. It was movement. Movement of something giant, something ancient, something that knew they were there before they entered the cave, that perhaps observed their approach, their investigation, their growing unease. Something intelligent enough to wait, to let them document what they found, to vocalize only when it decided their presence had crossed from acceptable curiosity to intolerable intrusion. Bryce's decision to speak out now, despite legal risks and professional consequences, stems from a growing conviction that silence serves no ethical purpose. The non-disclosure agreements were sold as necessary for safety, protecting the public from dangerous geological features, preventing reckless treasure hunters from injuring themselves seeking cryptid evidence. Bryce believes the real motivation was suppression of information that would force uncomfortable questions about what else we don't know about North American wildlife, about what government agencies have found and chosen not to disclose, about how much evidence has been collected and quietly buried under the weight of official secrecy. Bryce believes the evidence he kept, the images that survived confiscation, combined with his testimony about what they experienced in that cave, might finally shift the conversation from whether Bigfoot exists to what we do now that we know it does, and that it's been living right beneath our feet all along.